Countless so-called military history platforms discuss the MG42 and rehash the identical limited details about it. They concentrate primarily on its rapid firing rate, but entirely miss just how profoundly it actually influenced Allied leadership when it emerged in the conflict, or how they attempted to replicate it and employ it themselves. The Germans unveiled a totally novel idea to the globe, and remarkably enough, it still persists to this very day over 80 years afterward with the exact same armament in operation. All right, so let's begin all the way from the start so everything will be clear. Following the Great War, automatic weapons demonstrated just how they could transform combat, and they were clearly there to remain. Nevertheless, the Germans faced two challenges in the period after the First and prior to the Second global conflict. The initial was that they were prohibited from creating weapons because they received blame for the Great War, and they were defeated. But this was not much of a concern because they were conducting it regardless, just under cryptic designations and utilizing companies beyond Germany, where theoretically limitations were not enforced. The subsequent thing was that they conceived a novel approach of engagement instead of the devastating gridlock of trenches that defined the Western theater. They desired something lightweight and agile for the blitzkrieg. An obsolete water-cooled Maxim-style automatic weapons like the German MG08 simply were not matching that vision. They were controlled by a team of no fewer than 5 and measured over 100 pounds with coolant, stand, and all the components they required to function. So, in total confidentiality, the Germans initiated their quest towards the iconic MG42. The initial air-cooled, lightweight automatic weapon variants they developed, like the MG13, were magazine-supplied and contained only 25 cartridges, which provided them just about 2 seconds of sustained shooting. Or they utilized 75 cartridge drums that were undependable, so they pushed forward to generate a truly contemporary automatic weapon. But not just any automatic weapon. The Germans desired what is currently well recognized as the multi-purpose automatic weapon idea. They desired one quality armament that could function in numerous distinct setups and be installed on anything from automobiles, armored vehicles, and aircraft, and even utilized against low-altitude aircraft installed in lightweight or substantial setup, all with just one automatic weapon. And they achieved it. I am referring here naturally about the frequently disregarded MG34, the forerunner of the soon-to-arrive MG42. Now, why is this significant? Well, the situation is that the MG34 was the globe's initial multi-purpose automatic weapon with dependable and quite clever belt supply and a rapid barrel replacement mechanism. When it emerged for the initial time on the combat zone in the Spanish civil conflict, which the Germans utilized to evaluate their novel weapons, nobody in the globe had anything remotely similar to such an armament. But the Germans still were not content enough and commanded their designers to develop something even superior, but also to manufacture it substantially more affordable and quicker for large-scale manufacturing. You understand, the MG34 was a quality manufactured, refined apparatus. It was constructed from machined steel components with precise specifications that demanded expert workforce, about 150 worker hours just per individual unit. And it was not inexpensive. Those precise specifications made it undependable in the terrain, in contaminated or sub-freezing situations, if it was not carefully maintained. But most significantly, the challenge was expense and simplicity of manufacturing, once the conflict had transformed into a conflict of gradual losses. Signifying the result depended on which faction could out-manufacture the opposition and endure combat casualties for extended periods. This was the primary rationale behind unveiling yet another groundbreaking automatic weapon that transformed the globe so substantially. And you are now going to understand why. Now, German designers actually achieved those seemingly unattainable demands and generated an even superior automatic weapon, and also reduced the expense and duration of manufacturing in half. That was how the MG42 was created. Everything that could be was manufactured from pressed sheet steel, which reduced the manufacturing expense substantially. It now utilized a brief recoil roller-secured mechanism that permitted a superior firing rate. And because of more permissive specifications, it functioned superior in authentic combat zone situations than its predecessor. So fundamentally, the MG42 was inexpensive and rapid to manufacture, durable, straightforward, and had an extreme firing rate for automatic weapons even of current times, let alone of that era when it emerged in the Second World Conflict. The finest the Allies possessed in automatic weapons discharged about 600 cartridges per minute, while the MG42 had no less than double that with this firing rate, depending on the ammunition and mechanism, frequently achieving 1,500 cartridges per minute. It also unveiled a more straightforward and quicker rapid barrel replacement mechanism. Instead of releasing and rotating the housing and grip, then withdrawing the barrel from rear like in the MG34, the 42 would accomplish this from the flank with a straightforward clasp that would disconnect the barrel, and the controller could extract it with one hand, then insert a fresh one in and resume shooting. A properly instructed gunner with his supporter could accomplish this in about 4 seconds. But the disadvantage is that because of 20 cartridges traveling through the barrel per second, he had only a few seconds of shooting duration before he risked excessive heating his automatic weapon. An intriguing thing we could reference here is that the MG34 was the exclusive automatic weapon the Germans utilized in their armored vehicles as a hull or parallel automatic weapon, just because of this variation in barrel replacement mechanism. If they desired to manufacture the MG42 function inside an armored vehicle, they would have had to totally redesign the interior. So they remained with the 34, manufacturing it in concurrent until the conclusion of the conflict. So returning to the MG42 and why the Americans attempted to replicate it but were unable. The MG42 emerged on the combat zone for the initial time on the Eastern Theater in late 1941, where it was actually terrain evaluated before being advanced into large-scale manufacturing. The Germans appreciated what they witnessed in the terrain, so it was formally integrated into operation in early 1942, and the initial full-magnitude combat implementation was in North Africa with Rommel's Afrika Korps. It was not extended before alarmed accounts of Germany's novel, superior automatic weapon commenced arriving into Allied reconnaissance. The British Eighth Army confronted it during engagements in North Africa, and immediately acknowledged that novel distinctive shooting sound that did not sound anything like other automatic weapons of the period. The extraordinarily rapid firing rate manufactured it almost an individual sound, so it generated to those rehashed designations like Hitler's buzzsaw and comparable. But certainly for Allied personnel, it was not anything they would find amusing when they were on the receiving side of this what they designated burp gun. While German personnel were more than satisfied with their novel automatic weapons, the Allies had to manufacture propaganda films to settle down their outmatched personnel, attempting to ridicule the capability of the MG42 and portraying the image of it barking more than it could attack. They asserted that the reduced firing rate of Allied armaments was actually much more manageable and precise, and because of it more capable, while German automatic weapons purportedly just squandered ammunition and concentrated projectiles on a very limited area because of such a rapid firing rate. But attempt selling that to someone who was under MG42 shooting, because it was actually everything contrary to what they were claiming, especially if it was utilized with the Lafette stand, which we will reference afterward. So while they were attempting to settle and comfort their personnel, the Allies actually rushed to position their hands on this novel armament and manufacture it function for them. An even more substantial challenge was that the Germans structured their squads totally distinctly. They organized everything around the automatic weapon to manufacture the optimal utilization of its firepower. A typical infantry squad of 10 personnel consisted of a 3-individual automatic weapon crew, gunner, supporter, and ammunition carrier, 1 commander, and 6 riflemen with Kar 98 rifles. Riflemen ensured that the automatic weapon crew was secured while it operated as the squad's primary source of firepower in both protection and assault. Squads were even provided a donkey or an equine with a wagon to transport the ammunition, which was not quite lightweight, and the Germans even had brilliantly engineered ammunition containers. Unlike Allied ammunition containers, these were properly conceived, watertight with convenient collapsing handles positioned so 2 containers could be transported in one hand, but also collapsed to preserve space inside armored vehicles, for instance. Individual personnel could, in an urgent situation, dash out and return with 4 250 cartridge containers. Attempt accomplishing that with American containers without injuring your legs. Finally, some undamaged MG42s were seized with ammunition in North Africa, Sicily, and the Eastern Theater, and they were immediately dispatched to Allied laboratories to initiate comprehensive evaluation. In February 1943, the U.S. Aberdeen Verification Facility now had almost all specifications on this gun, and they were captivated by how technologically sophisticated it was. In reality, they appreciated it so substantially that they now initiated a program to replicate it and manufacture it function in their .30 .06 caliber. This generated to the generation of the T-24, which essentially was the nearest to the original MG42 the Americans could construct, just recalibrated in their caliber. Utilizing or directly replicating the original MG42s would not be so capable because they would have had to also unveil another caliber that would complicate manufacturing and provision for the American military. Nevertheless, already from the beginning, challenges commenced to surface. Although the T-24 had a functioning mechanism precisely the identical as the MG42, American designers were commanded to attempt to slightly reduce the firing rate to somewhere around 800 cartridges per minute to be more manageable and not squander as much ammunition. So they positioned in about a twice as substantial mechanism and a more rigid return mechanism, which unveiled novel complications. The .30-06 is 7.62 x 63 mm, whereas the MG42 was calibrated in the German 7.92 x 57 mm Mauser cartridge. So you understand that the American cartridge is about a 1/4 inch extended with a slightly reduced caliber. This seemingly minor variation actually had substantial consequences when it arrived to supplying and withdrawal during shooting. When the initial T-24 prototype was evaluated, it failed almost immediately, shooting just 1 cartridge and then jamming, failing to discharge the expended casing. So they resolved it manually and discharged again. But the identical thing occurred. Essentially, they had a single-shot MG42 now. So the subsequent prototype was constructed that could actually discharge fully automatic. Nevertheless, it also experienced horribly from frequent discharge and supplying failures. Out of 1,500 cartridges discharged during the evaluation, it had 51 malfunctions. And also, it had a firing rate of only about 600 cartridges per minute, which was the identical rate they already possessed in their automatic weapons. The extraordinarily substantial mechanism reduced the cycling velocity too substantially, and also added a substantial increase in recoiling mass that would fracture components of the gun after just a few hundred cartridges discharged. American designers attempted really intensely to manufacture this otherwise exceptional automatic weapon replica function. But in March 1944, they finally surrendered and determined to position a suspension on the program and concentrate more on manufacturing of the automatic weapons they were already acquainted with. The origin of the challenges was deemed the 30-06 cartridge that was simply too extended for the original MG42 engineering. So manufacturing it function in this caliber would demand more than straightforward recalibration with a novel barrel, fundamentally constructing the gun totally from the foundation up, which in itself terminated off the concept of simply replicating a superior German engineering and rapidly deploying it to balance the combat zone in firepower. The American military persisted pushing what already functioned, concentrating on the enhanced M19-119 with a buttstock and support and the bar to operate as the squad's enhancement of firepower. They also possessed an enormous quantity of M2 Browning, the iconic 50 calibers that were too substantial for typical infantry utilization, but were installed on literally everything that possessed tracks, wheels, wings, and even on vessels. They manufactured quite a few complications for German personnel who detested the devastating power of the 50 BMG cartridge. And in the subsequent stages of the conflict, they were literally everywhere on the combat zone. Nevertheless, this failure to directly replicate the MG42 did not signify Americans would not utilize its elements that were much superior than those in their automatic weapons. In the 1950s, after the conflict had concluded, they were assessing the whole idea of the multi-purpose automatic weapon and comprehended that the Germans were correct. It is much superior to possess one quality armament and then manufacture it function in every role than manufacturing every individual separate one like lightweight, medium and substantial automatic weapons, each with separate mechanisms or calibers. So they acknowledge the German FG42, which is designated the paratroop rifle. They witnessed its quite satisfactory ergonomics and compact dimensions, a superior gas mechanism for the novel NATO 7.62 X51 cartridge, and determined to merge it with the MG42 belt, supplying mechanism, and rapid barrel replacement mechanism with some integration of American modifications. This eventually generated the M60 automatic weapon that would become renowned during the Vietnam conflict. Although early variants were not too dependable and the barrel replacement mechanism functioned more in theory than in practice, over duration they resolved out all the challenges and subsequent variants of the M60 were quite solid multi-purpose automatic weapons. They were installed extensively on jeeps, trucks, armored automobiles, and even helicopters and vessels in all types of setups and terrain modifications. It had about half the firing rate of the MG42, but the supplying mechanism was directly influenced by the MG42, while ergonomics and the gas mechanism, as we stated, originated from the FG42 along with other modifications designers manufactured. Now, the genuine twist in the narrative of the MG42 actually occurs after the conflict for which it was generated. You all recognize how it concluded for the Germans and all that. So they were once again in the period after the conflict fundamentally prohibited to possess a military. But that transformed with the NATO partnership. You understand, after the conflict, Americans were not the exclusive ones attempting to replicate or utilize existing seized stockpiles of this incredibly capable automatic weapon. For instance, Yugoslavia generated one of the finest direct replicas of the MG42 in the original caliber, just reducing the firing rate a bit and renaming it M53. They large-scale manufactured it and integrated it for their military, and it remained in operation for decades. But the most substantial adopter of the MG42 after the conflict, and the ones who still utilize them to this very day, is no other than Germany. Again, in the 1950s, the newly established NATO partnership permitted West Germany under their supervision to rearm and establish a novel military now as their partner. So the Germans examined the assessment at the most contemporary automatic weapons at the period and comprehended that they already possessed something much superior and were already acquainted with it. They acquired the verified MG42 engineering and redesigned it for the novel NATO typical caliber 7.62 x 51. Although they also persisted manufacturing of original MG42s in the original caliber. Because technical blueprints for the MG42 were seized by the Soviets at the conclusion of the conflict, the German corporation Rheinmetall actually had to reverse design and effectively replicate their own automatic weapon. This modernization of the MG42 generated to the generation of the MG3. Besides the novel NATO caliber, the MG3 arrived with some refinement for more contemporary combat, like installations for automobiles and slightly enhanced metallurgy and completion, but it retained the extraordinarily rapid firing rate and actually was provided with two mechanism types of distinct weight. The typical one provided the original firing rate of about 1,200 cartridges per minute. But if required, a more substantial mechanism could be installed instead that reduced the rate to about 800 cartridges per minute. And this could be simply accomplished with no transformations in the controlling mechanism, just by exchanging the mechanism and permitting the weight variation accomplish the task. So personnel could adjust their armament for how they appreciated it more. But we also referenced the Lafette stand earlier, and this is, if you inquire me, perhaps the most intriguing feature of German automatic weapons that released their full capability, and it is also transported on with the MG3. But the contemporary field Lafette, although maintaining the installation for optics for some rationale, did not retain the most brilliant feature. So this stand transformed the identical automatic weapon from a lightweight to a substantial setup, and it functioned both with the MG34 and 42. The gun was installed on it and could be utilized with optics. It had buffer mechanisms that absorbed recoil and manufactured the gun very stable and precise even at extended range. The activation was constructed into the installation, and the gunner discharged without grasping the gun itself, so vibrations would not influence the targeting. It could even be utilized for indirect shooting, something like very lightweight artillery for area restriction. Nevertheless, the deadliest feature it possessed was the apparatus designated the Tiefenfeuerautomat, which signifies something like automatic search shooting mechanism. It was fundamentally an analog computer, something like a mechanical timepiece, where the team could preset shooting zones by securing in elevation restrictions. Once those were established, the installation would slowly shift the gun's targeting up and down in a preset arc as it discharged. That signified when the gunner extracted the activation, the MG would automatically sweep across the elimination zone, walking the burst through an entire slope or a stretch of pathway without requiring to contact the controls. With this installation, the gun was also much reduced to the ground, and the gunner could even discharge through a periscope sight while remaining behind protection. That manufactured it much more difficult to locate the location, and clearly more difficult to eliminate it out. The Germans sometimes utilized this to generate chaos and confusion on the combat zone by positioning the automatic weapon and attaching a string to the activation of the installation. They would then discharge it remotely from protection without even being there, and the gun would sweep across the elimination zone as extended as it possessed ammunition. The MG42 had transformed the globe of automatic weapons so profoundly that almost every multi-purpose automatic weapon after the Second World Conflict incorporated some influence or another from it. The MG3 is currently still in operation with over 30 nations, usually installed on armored vehicles and automobiles, with novel shooting control platforms to genuinely utilize the full capability of its rapid firing rate. Perhaps when extraterrestrials invade us with their laser armaments, we will still be discharging extended bursts from MG42 variants at